Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Caribbean Progress, a podcast of the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute. Today, we will be talking about Próspera ZEDE in Roatan, Honduras. It's one of the very few charter city projects gaining traction. You'll be hearing the term ZEDE quite often in the episode. ZEDE is a short version for the Spanish term Zona de Empleo y Desarrollo Económico, or Zone for Employment and Economic Development in English. This is the official term used in the laws of Honduras for this kind of special economic zone. Próspera is staggeringly ambitious, and I want to dive into the nitty-gritty details regarding its place in the constitutional landscape of Honduras. My guest today is Humberto Macias. He previously served as the Deputy General Counsel of Honduras Próspera, the promoter behind Próspera ZEDE. He was the first team member to relocate to Honduras to build Próspera ZEDE and continues to reside in the country today. This is going to be a very fun episode, so please stay tuned. Hi, Humberto, and thank you so much for coming on the show to discuss Próspera. It's been one of those topics that comes up quite often. Anyone talks about charter cities. So, of course, we're going to have a more sustained conversation just about Próspera. And Próspera, of course, is actually been there. We've met in person in Próspera. Very nice location. So I had a first-hand experience with the jurisdiction as well. But I want to just start with what has been the growth of Próspera from your perspective, obviously working there, working very close with the development plan and the future plans. What's been the main highlights for you in the project so far?
Well, Próspera has had pretty tremendous growth since it started. Most of everything got going around in 2016 when the team was beginning to prospect for land and engaging with discussions with the national government. And they were also meeting with local leaders and trying to explain the vision and understand the local priorities. And once that was done in 2017 and 2018, Próspera acquired local property so that it could serve as a physical footprint. And it legally incorporated that into the ZEDE regime and proposed its charter. So that was in 2018. In 2020, it continued developing the legal framework. And in May 2020, it officially launched. I arrived here in Honduras in 2019 in August, so right at the beginning of that process. In 2021, right around the time that you visited, a little bit before you visited, there were 58 acres and there were 3 buildings that were there on the property. Essentially, since that time, it's just experienced some pretty rapid growth, and that includes encompassing now over 1,000 acres. I don't know if you've seen it on Twitter or anywhere else, but there's the new building, Duna, the residential tower that's being completed. So that should be completed by the end of the year. It's a 14-story residential office and retail space. So that's finishing. There's about 1,000 e-residents now from about 43 countries. And there are currently about 100 firms there, companies. They span the gamut. So there's things like advanced fabrication technology, biotech, banking and fintech, drone delivery, a Montessori school. So there's been quite a lot of that's been happening in these last couple of years. Right now, there's 2 more residential developments that are scheduled to break ground later in the year. And Próspera is also in the process of developing an industrial port in La Ceiba. What that's meant to do is bring high quality manufacturing jobs to Honduras and also address the demand for quality nearshoring facilities in Central America. So basically what's been happening since 2016 until now. I think that the second question you were asking was what I've most enjoyed about the process. I arrived here in Honduras in 2019 in August, and I was the first person to actually come to work on the project. I continue to be in Tegucigalpa right now, the capital of Honduras. And so I remember the first time that I ever saw Roatan just flying in, I was just so amazed by the beauty because you could see it as you're flying from the mainland. As you approach it, you can just see the blue waters all around, and you can see where the shades of the coral are. I was just really amazed by that. And, that first time I was the only one who was there. It was just me with the technical secretary at the time. The technical secretary is like the mayor of the zone. So we were the only ones there, and gave me a private tour and he showed me around the island a little bit. But what's been really great has been flying back regularly and seeing the growth and meeting the people that are joining the team and that are also becoming residents. Because every time that I've gone back, I've seen more and more talent, more and more people. It's a very vibrant community. So I think for me, just watching that blossom has been probably the best experience.
Fantastic. And yeah, I took that flight also from Tegucigalpa. No, I think from San Pedro Sula. And me growing up in the Caribbean, of course, the structure of Roatan, it feels very familiar to me. So I felt, obviously, oh, this is just like where I grew up. This is exactly what I pictured this to be. And coming in, seeing it, just like any other Caribbean country, essentially, and knowing that Prosper is actually doing this project there, Roatan, it obviously gives me ideas about how this project could be done in many other Caribbean countries, because it has this very similar structure, even similar history in many ways. And also, I remember when it was there, you were very excited about the tower that was going to be started construction at a point very soon. When I went, it was just essentially a hole in the ground just being dug out for the foundation base. And seeing this from your Twitter, I actually see the structure going up. Now it's like, hey, I was there when it was just an idea. So even like, for me, seeing it is kind of very cool also.
I agree. Just watching it as it gets higher and higher, and it's the tallest structure in the Bay Islands. It's 2 times taller than anything else. So it's got incredible views from the top of the building.
Yeah, I'm sure it does. Tell me, how many people are living at least partial time in the zone currently?
I don't know exactly, because there's a lot of people that come in and out of the zone. So you see activity, but it's hard for me to know exactly how many people are there. But what I do know is that the intention is that Dunas is supposed to be the foundation for e-residents to be able to move in and start creating community. Right now, there is existing infrastructure. There's restaurants, a country club, there's different shops, there's a golf course, a hotel. There are businesses there, there's villas. I think this is meant to really create a foundation for people to move in and start working and living there.
Yeah, because that was one of the questions I had for you and some other the Prosper team at the event that time, because they were in Preston Bay. There were these very nice houses, but I'm like, people can't really afford these in most cases. Just like you mentioned, the new tower and the similar type towers that are going to be built. What's the price range for either rent in the new towers that are being built, to give people an idea of the different price comparisons?
Basically, this first tower is meant to be for young working professionals, and to purchase, if I'm not mistaken, it's about $80,000 to about $200,000. Besides that, there are additional projects. I mentioned that there's 2 more developments that are coming along. The price points for those are a little bit higher. So this one is meant to be primarily for young professionals that are moving into the zone, starting businesses or working with other companies overseas.
Is the primary target audience international people, or let's say mainland Hondurans, upper middle class, and so on? Or is it a mix of both?
For this one here, for the first one for Duna?
Yes, first one, yeah.
It's a mix. The target market is people interested in the zone. And I think because there's a wide diversity in that, it's hard to say that it's focused on just foreigners or just Hondurans. When I go back there, I see primarily Hondurans in the zone. That's largely who's working there and who's doing a lot of the different projects. But as it builds up, we do expect that there'll be more foreigners coming in. And usually the foreigners that I see, usually they're there for shorter events or to visit, to work on specific projects. But the idea is to grow that.
Also, this is a minute point, but something that I was surprised by. So when I was there in the zone, I remember I was seeing some people, you were saying, hey, yeah, these are some Roatan people. In my mind, like, they're white. Are you sure? But because of the historical difference between Roatan and mainland Honduras, it actually does have a different makeup population, actually black and white and so on. And just by seeing the people in Roatan, you get a bit confused. Sometimes when you see a picture, you might say, oh, these are just for foreign people, but they actually are just people who born and raised in Roatan.
It's very diverse because it has the original inhabitants were white British and blacks. And then you start getting in, there are mestizo Hondurans that start moving into the island. I suppose there were also the original indigenous people. I don't think there were any left when everybody was coming in. And then you start getting waves of different types of foreigners. So it's a very diverse island.
Yeah, and also the language. Roatan speaks English. Not sure primarily, but most people who grew up in Roatan speak English as even their default language. That's also a very big surprise to most people, thinking, oh, it's in Honduras, therefore, of course, Spanish. But Roatan was a particular special area where it was actually a British colony for a long time. So you have that English legacy as well. It Roatan makes a very unique location, even in Honduras.
Yeah, just because it was a British colony, you do have that. Because you have that colonial legacy, you do have a lot more British stock in the population. You have a lot of different groups who speak English. So in some ways, it's quite Western, more Western than mainland Honduras. I myself, when I arrived, I didn't realize that there would be such a big difference in cultures. But the other 17 departments of Honduras, they're more like of a Spanish indigenous mix. So you have that mestizo background for the mainland. And then the Bay Islands, and Roatan is one of those Bay Islands, is a little bit different than the rest of the country.
So I want to go back a bit to the legal foundation of Próspera, because that has recently caused some issues when it comes down to the new Castro administration of the government in Honduras, where recently the Castro administration, Xiomara Castro, the new president, and the Congress decided to repeal the law that essentially created the regulations for the ZEDE projects like Próspera to exist. And one of the issues that they said was that the original ZEDE law was passed in a time where it was post-constitutional crisis in Honduras, and therefore now it's time that the administration has begun what they consider to be legitimate grounds in their governance. They want to repeal the law. Before we get to that, however, I want to say, what's your take on the original law being passed? What's the context of it? Why did it happen? And do you think that kind of argument from the Castro administration actually has some kind of legal standing when it comes to the process for repeal?
I don't remember if I mentioned to you, but I started working on the project in about 2011. So at the time I lived in Singapore. And so I met these different Honduran political figures that came to Singapore to learn about the country. From what I understood and what I understand better now, there was a political crisis in 2009 that frightened away investment, and they wanted to look for ways to spur socioeconomic development in the country. And there were a group of Hondurans who were looking out at the world, and they saw that there were models that had been quite successful internationally. And when you think about these, particularly about Hong Kong, and then after that, Singapore, and then after that, Dubai. So they're looking at these. They were also looking at Songdo in South Korea. And so what they wanted to do was create a legal space for something like that in Honduras. So that was really what motivated these legal advancements. They wanted to create the legal space for something like this. And partially what you see, not just in Honduras, but in a lot of Latin America, you have these entrenched interests that make it very hard to change anything. So the idea is that you had a clean slate where you can recreate this without these entrenched interests interfering and just giving it a space to thrive. Then you can create something pretty amazing in Latin America. That was the context. So I met them because one of the things that they were doing was they went to go look at these special economic zones in Asia. And I happened to live in Singapore at the time. I lived there for about 10 years. And so I had the opportunity to meet them. For my time living in Singapore, just seeing the dramatic changes, I was a believer from day one that this could be done, at least that it was possible. But I do understand that I think when you're looking at the history of Latin America, that's part of what complicates development for the entire region, because you end up going from left to right, from left to right. When you make that transition, usually what happens is the new powers want to destroy everything that the old administration created. And so you just never advance because you make progress for years in one direction and then you destroy that and then you move in another direction, and it's just very hard to advance. So one of the reasons that they create the ZEDE regime the way that they did is that they wanted to give it the strongest legal protections, because they knew that given the history of the country, there would be these variations. And so what they wanted to do was create something that even when new administration came in that was moving to the left, that it would have the legal protections to withstand that and give it the time and space to prove that it can work. It's not at all surprising when the new administration came in and their intention was to repeal this. That was entirely expected when this was created. What you see in the country right now is that it's a socialist party who won the elections. And now what it seems to be doing is it's trying to solidify its control over the country, and doing this through governmental intervention and expropriation in like the energy sector, for example, special tax regimes, autonomous zones, agro-industry. You see that process. And what you see here in Tegucigalpa right now, what I can see from here is that there are a lot of interventions and interferences with government, and there are just deficiencies in public services. And this framework was specifically created to protect against those types of changes, just to be able to give this space to grow and prove itself. And once you're able to prove that this can function, then you can begin adopting the same types of policies in the rest of the country so that you could spur the same type of change. A little bit like what happened with China and Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and then spreading the special economic zones to the rest of the country to spur prosperity. It's a little bit like that, what this was intended to do, the way that it was created.
I get that the general left-wing governments usually have very curious economic policies, often quite bad economic policies in general. But the basis from which the Castro administration has campaigned and essentially pushed the repeal of the ZEDE laws is hard to comprehend. I don't really follow the argument they're making. Of course, the main argument is the ZEDE law essentially takes sovereignty, of course never redefined, takes sovereignty away from the Honduran administration and gives it to this category of non-Hondurans. Of course, they don't actually explain how that happens. They don't actually explain what examples of this have occurred. They just make the statement and move on. And that has been a substantial political rallying call during the campaigns and so on. I understand why that is an appealing political tactic for the electorate who is not particularly super well-versed in international foreign policy, international foreign law. But what I don't get is why the Congress was so willing to repeal the law, and it was a unanimous vote, if I remember, to repeal the ZEDE Law. What's the political context and misunderstanding why the National Congress was so willing to repeal these kind of laws that are very clear indications of economic progress potentially for Honduras?
One thing that is important to really kind of understand is that there's really 2 points. One, I think that there were a lot of attacks against the ZEDE regime, and that's partially because it was associated with the last president. And so there were a lot of attacks based on that. But what I saw was a lot of misinformation. I saw a lot of blatant lies. And so for people that aren't actually within the zone or around the zone, it's hard for them to personally verify what's happening. And so when you're reading about these things, and especially in a population that has very low academic levels, it's very easy to misinform and to manipulate the population. And that's what I saw here in this case. You would see that there were concerns that were based on this information and these blatant lies. Another thing that I saw during this process is that usually you would see a very small groups of people that were very loud. It makes it appear that there's more opposition to this. But when you actually look at the polls from around the campaign time, this was actually something that was of much lower interest to the population. What they really wanted was things like security, and they wanted things like jobs. And so this was much lower, but there were some people that were quite loud, and it was a very small minority. That's what you would see sometimes in the media. So I think there was that perception that there was opposition to the ZEDEs. I think you need to kind of consider those two factors. When the new Congress came in, they were seeing some of these different things going on. So what they did is they decided to vote to repeal. When you actually look at the context of that repeal, is that it wasn't something that everybody that voted for it to repeal it was interested in destroying them. Some of those people that voted for it understood that the three ZEDEs that were existing had acquired rights and would continue. Some of the people that voted to repeal it, their expectation was that in Honduras, you have to do the repeal, and then a year later, you have to ratify it. And so their expectation was that within that year, the current administration would negotiate or would come up with some alternative, some solution for these existing businesses to move into those zones. But that just happened. And there was a lot of emotion in a very polarized country at around the time of the election. But when you look at the situation now, you look at the ratification and it hasn't happened. There doesn't seem to be the appetite for it to pass. And I think it's because things have changed during that process. When you look at the vote for that, I think things have changed significantly since then.
Is there another reason or another context why the Congress was so willing to repeal the ZEDE organic law? Was it just because they wanted an easy political win, to put it that way? And then why was it that the Congress was so overwhelmingly supporting the Castro administration's need to repeal the law, where before I saw that there was some context where when the law was originally passed, it was not super strongly supported by the National Congress at the time, but because there was some few really key players in the law being pushed by the Hernandez administration, and that's why it went through. But it seems so very strange that the Congress was a unanimous vote against the ZEDE rule.
I don't understand the internal dynamics of the Honduran Congress very well, but what I have seen is when they passed the ZEDE law, it actually, I don't remember if it was unanimous or just near unanimous, but it was a very strong approval for the ZEDE regime. And I think partially what it has to do is the fact that this country is very polarized and it goes to extremes. So I think related to that is why you see these big changes in votes. But if you look at the situation now where they would have needed to ratify that hasn't happened. And I think it's partially because the situation has changed since then.
So now that the ZEDE organic law has been repealed, what is the actual implication of that being repealed? It doesn't mean that Próspera automatically has to stop operations. Clearly, that's not the case. But what actually is the legal ramifications and legal effect of the ZEDE law being repealed by the Castro administration? This is last year.
I think the legal effect for Próspera is quite minimal because of the protections that were created. When you think of every type of legal protection that you could provide to the ZEDE framework, that was done. So there's at the constitutional level, the fact that the Constitution was amended so that you could include the ZEDE regime within that, the legal stability stability agreements, international trade agreements. So because of that, there's a very strong framework. And I think when somebody is analyzing those legal protections, it gives them confidence in how strong the framework is. It's the strongest one in existence in the world. I think it's understood that Latin America can be a difficult business environment. And so you need strong legal protections to foreign direct investment. I think that is the first initial thing. When you look at what's happening at the level of the administration, at least what I see here is that once in a while, there are radical elements of the administration that will make anti-ZEDE comments. It usually hasn't moved beyond that. And I think sometimes it's been because they're more isolated elements. Sometimes there's been because there's been some education that kind of helps them understand the legal protections. And so then they kind of take a step back. But there has been an impact. When you look at, for example, before this, an Honduran legal entity could have access to Honduran banking. And since then, that's been blocked. Also, Próspera has, because of the type of zone it is, there was basically special customs processes for imports and exports out of the zone. And that's also been blocked. So there has been an impact, I think, at the legal level in terms of things that are tangential to the framework. So things where the national government is required to connect with the ZEDE framework. I think at that point is where you've seen some impacts. Also, what you hear in the media, at least when I'm here, especially at this time in the country, I don't know if you've been seeing the news. I think as of like yesterday, there were about 27 massacres in mainland Honduras. There are severe energy shortages. So there's blackouts throughout the country, particularly in the north. They started doing a curfew. And actually it starts today in San Pedro Sula, which is the economic heart of the country. When you start seeing that there's so many problems in the country, this issue just becomes second. It loses a lot of priority because there are just real basic problems that the country is facing.
Yeah, and I've been seeing these news stories, but I guess the better term is hit pieces, even from the international organizations. That's why it's even more surprising in some ways. Various left-wing organizations about the quote-unquote problems of special economic zones in Honduras, particularly Próspera and so on. And I read them or watch them, and again, it is very surprising because what they are saying is literally false. Because even I don't know that much of Próspera myself, but I've been there, so I've taught people there and so on. So even those basic things they're saying, oh, they have their own police force and this and that, like that's not granted in the laws. So these hit pieces go to very well accusations, but Próspera, I think that really also doesn't help in terms of the marketing of the project in Honduras. But even before we go there, I know there's some stuff to ask here. When it comes to the repeal of the ZEDE law, is it true that it has to be done essentially twice, where it has one vote to repeal and then at another Congress it has to also be repealed again? Did that happen twice or was it only one time?
You're correct. When I mentioned that they try to provide the ZEDE regime with every legal protection that they could, one of them is that they amended the Constitution so that the ZEDE regime could be within that. There were a couple articles of the Constitution. It was Articles 294, 303, and 329 that were amended to create a legal space for the ZEDE regime. And by doing that, what that requires is to have an amendment to the Constitution. You need to first repeal, and then you need to ratify that repeal in the second congressional session. And part of the reason they do that is because there is a lot of polarization in the country and the situation is quite fluid. And so what they want to do is make sure that any changes aren't to very unique situations that are happening in the country and that there's an extended support for that. So that was one of the legal protections for the ZEDE regime. Yes, it was repealed, but then it was not ratified. And it hasn't been ratified since Congress began this last session. It was one of the things that I was mentioning to you before, that there was that initial vote, but as time has progressed, and I think there were different reasons. I can't speak to why any individual congressman voted the way they are. There are things that I've heard, but what it seems to be happening is some of the expectations that they had weren't met during the year. Now there's been a change of opinion about that. So that hasn't happened, and that was one of the legal protections that was provided to the ZEDE regime.
There's another argument I've heard that it regards to, is it the Kuwait Bilateral Treaty with Honduras, where it changes the baseline for essentially treaty reforms, where it has to have at least a minimum of 50 years before you can actually repeal these, say, fundamental treaty adjustments in the Constitution, or essentially the foreign investment. Because Próspera obviously counts as a large foreign investment, then that baseline should also be applied to Kuwait. Could you explain what that means, if I even have that correct?
Yeah, you're correct. So basically, what a lot of the international trade treaties include is a most favored nation status. So like, for example, with CAFTA, which is the agreement with the U.S., Central America, and the Dominican Republic, there is that type of protection. And so what that seeks to do is all of these countries are trying to ensure that if a foreign investor is coming into one of those countries, they won't get better treatment than anybody who signed the agreement. So in this case, for example, like if you're an American investor, because of CAFTA, you're guaranteed that you could have this most favored nation status. And so you have these protections, but if something more is given to another foreign investor, you also get the same rights and protections. And so what was done in this case was there's that bilateral trade agreement with Kuwait that specifically and expressly protects the ZEDE legal regime. This provides the 50 years of protection. And so because that is granted to Kuwaiti investors because of the most favored nation status, then it's also granted to American investors, those from Dominican Republic, so the other countries that signed to that agreement. So that's basically how American investors get those protections.
Do you know why that long period was granted to Kuwait Investment Treaty in the first place?
When you look at how long it takes to develop any one of these zones, they're not things that happen overnight, and you can make rapid progress, but to be able to move from Hong Kong in the 50s to what you see now, it took considerable time, maybe about 5 decades. Singapore was something similar. It gained independence in 65, and it took quite a long time for it to develop to the time that it's at, to what it's like now. And so you do need this time. You do need these consistent policies to be able to grow something like that. If you're granted a lower amount of time, then it's just going to be very hard to really create that vision. So that was why these are long-term protections.
So why Kuwait? Kuwait also has an investment in Prosper in a separate ZEDE, or was there some potentiality of investment from Kuwait or some Kuwaiti company?
I don't know this directly. I've heard this from different people that I've spoken to in the time that I've been involved, but it does seem like there's been a lot of interest from different types of investments, including Middle Eastern ones. So that was the reason for that. There was the hope that could create a way to channel a Middle Eastern investor into Honduras.
When this information about the treaty agreements about Honduras and the time period and the more favored nation clauses in the treaties, does this give the Honduran politicians more pause when it comes to being so negative about these ZEDE projects and also being in favor of having it repealed and leave Honduras, because it seems like this will open up Honduras to quite substantial damages when it comes to these kind of laws that they're kind of repealing in a very abrupt fashion? Does that give them pause, or do they just become indifferent to these activities given the facts about the treaty agreements?
I do think that gives them pause. For example, you were asking a little bit earlier about why when they repealed it, it was unanimous and there's been a change since then. One of the reasons is that I think they became aware of things like that, then makes them realize that it's not something that's going to be beneficial for the country. I do think that for some elements that has given them pause. I think for some elements that has not given them pause, especially some more on the radical side. And I don't think it just applies to Prosper. If you look at the arbitral tribunal actually the center where these disputes are being heard is ICSID, so the World Bank's ICSID. And Prosper's is one of 7 disputes now that the state of Honduras has there. And 6 of them arose during the time of the Castro administration. So it hasn't just been ZEDEs, like it's just been a general approach to all types of investments and all types of businesses.
So now, I kind of mentioned just before this, there's a lot of civil society pushback. It seems to be mostly internationally, from what I can gather, about the Prosper project in Roatan and Honduras. What's the usual arguments that these organizations try to use to talk about why Prosper is not good for, they always say, the people of Honduras? What's their main argument path for trying to essentially give Prosper a very bad name in the global standing?
I think it depends on who these actors are because they focus on different things. But for example, you do hear concerns about sovereignty, or you do hear concerns about democracy. You do hear concerns about the environment, about indigenous people's rights, about labor rights. So those are the things that you do hear. Based on my experience and knowledge of Prosper and the country, I fully disagree with all of those. I do think that at the national level, sometimes it's due to misinformation. Sometimes these views are based on just blatant lies. I do think at the international level that there are allies and different actors that repeat these, but that actually have never been to the country and really don't understand. I've seen panels and I've seen articles, and I often will respond to the people and invite them to come visit me here in my home. And I will gladly show them in person what the country is like and what is happening in the jurisdiction. But up until this point, I have not had any one person accept.
Of course. Yeah, that makes sense. Because again, every time I see or hear or read these arguments, I'm like, yeah, but if you actually just go to Roatan, you will know that what you're saying doesn't make any sense. And granted, there are reasonable arguments that one could make if you don't, let's say, have a strong preference for that kind of developmental policy. But you have to actually make those arguments and not these other, I wouldn't even say they actually count as arguments, but these statements, and it doesn't make any sense to me either. I see also that there was one recently where they even had like maybe one or two people from Crawfish Bay being interviewed about how they don't like Próspera, but then what they were talking about to me didn't even seem like Próspera, but that's a whole different thing.
You know what's interesting? At least when I see concerns emanating from some of these local areas, usually what I see is it'll be one or two people that claim to represent 8 different communities. But when you actually go to the community, for example, specifically with Crawfish Rock, I know that Próspera is the biggest employer in that community. And there are many, many people from that community that work in the project and support it. But you do have some limited voices that are a bit more visible. When you were asking me about some of the things that I most enjoyed about the process or about the time here with the jurisdiction, one of them has been going back and getting to know Hondurans that are now prospering and are having opportunities because of Próspera. There's so much talent in Honduras and in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And it's just that we don't have the proper ecosystems to help people just thrive. So for the Hondurans that I see go to Próspera, and when I see them thrive, I think that is very fulfilling.
Yes. So as we're coming to the end of the conversation, you had mentioned that there are some obstructions that happened when the law was originally repealed last year, some daily operation customs and banking access. Now, did law have to officially get reinstated for things to stabilize and go forward? Or does it essentially nothing changes per se and you have to kind of just get the operations back to a more alignment with the public sector in the Honduran government?
At least for Próspera and the 2 other ZEDEs that were created. I'm not sure if you're aware of them, but one of them is in Choloma in Honduras, and another one is down south. I'm going blank on the name right now, but another one is down south. So for these that have already been created, they have acquired rights and they have all of these legal protections that apply. So for those, nothing needs to be changed because nothing has changed for them at the legal level. What would be quite helpful, I know that the vision of Próspera is to bring in foreign direct investment, to create jobs, to just help position Honduras as a place for nearshoring in Latin America. So there are these key things that Próspera is working towards. Some of the rhetoric and also some of these actions at the periphery, they do cause delays in the development. And I think that's frustrating when you think that there's 74% of the people in Honduras are poor. Any delay in creating jobs for them, it's quite sad to see that that's happening because you could be changing lives. I think so for Próspera, I think the things that could be useful would be to basically reinstate things like the banking and the customs, and also just give assurances that they're not going to interfere with the project. There's some very basic things that could be done that would enable the jurisdiction to move forward much faster. When you look at the progress, I was telling you earlier about the progress of the jurisdiction, but when I give you the context of that progress, Próspera was launched in May 2020. So this was literally in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Now there are these different winds that are coming because of the election and things that are happening at the level of the administration that are slowing the progress down. And despite that, the project has advanced quite far. If we didn't have that at the zone, then I think there would be much more progress. And I think if those things could be alleviated, those to the customers, the banking and the assurances, if those things could be done, it would help Próspera move along a lot faster and bring forward that vision that it has for Honduras and for Hondurans.
Thank you so much, Humberto. This has been a very entertaining and interesting conversation. And I'm hopeful we could do another one in the future when there's some even more progress happening in Próspera, maybe in person in Próspera. I'll come back.
You know what? That would be great.
Thank you very much.